But what we have in terms of per capita GDP at PPP, Ukraine is much lower than all countries. This is the same or similar share of adult population with tertiary completed education. And unlike Poland, for example, the situation with GDP per capita worsened since 1990. Despite multiple transition challenges and declining youth population, Ukraine spends a significant share of its GDP on education. So among all countries which provided information on government expenditure, in World Bank statistics, Ukraine is in the top 20 countries, and it spends more than the US, Korea, and many other countries in the world. And it spends 2% now on tertiary education. So we have, it seems that we have well-educated workforce. But according to BIP's surveys, before the crisis in 2008, inadequately educated workforce was among the major constraints to job growth. And to business growth. Since that time, according to the last survey in 2013, workforce skills not among the top impediments, obstacles, but it doesn't mean that workforce skills improved. It just means that there are more important obstacles, and World Bank study survey of employers in 2014 also showed that workforce skills are less important constraint to business growth than political instability, macroeconomic instability, corruption, informal practices, and many other problems of doing business in Ukraine. And according to this survey of over 700 companies from two sectors in Ukraine, many employers, they complain about the skills and skills provided by the education system. And less than 30% of employers, they tell that they are in fact satisfied with the skills provided by the system of education, by training in vocational education and the technical and vocational education training and general education system. So the question is, why do firms complain of a skills shortage despite the high availability of the educated workers, and why highly educated workforce cannot generate economic output at a level similar to worse in advanced economies? And in the literature, EBRD transition report, Stuck in Transition in 2013, World Bank studies skills, not diplomas, job growth in NaUKMA countries. There are several explanations from this side of the human capital. It might be that there is low quality in the relevance of education, and we will see some evidence on this. Institutional environment not conducive to developing, attracting and retaining highly skilled people, and skills mismatch. And my main focus is on the last point, this skills mismatch, mismatch between the skills acquired during formal education and those required in the labor market. And of course, skills mismatch is not the same as this mismatch between education and job requirements, but it is very difficult to measure the skills mismatch. So I focus on vertical mismatch in terms of education. So I look on the incidence of overeducation, the number of people, of employed people who has more education than the current job requires, and undereducation, the number of the share of employed who have less education than the current job requires. And some evidence in Ukraine, according to school-to-work transition survey, most young people tell that their education was relevant for performing jobs, but some of them felt overqualified, and about 11% reported that they have some gaps. And at the same time, then there is direct question whether your education corresponds, meets completely job responsibilities. About 30% told that not. Moreover, about 40% of the total number of young unemployed have tertiary college or university education, and almost half of them reported inability to find a job after graduation is the main reason for their unemployment. And according to the normative measure, based on these data, about 31% can be classified as overeducated, only young people. I did in my first study, based on STEP and PIAC data, I tried to compare incidence of overeducation, undereducation in Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, and Macedonia covered by World Bank STEP study, and OECD countries and Russia covered by OECD PIAC survey of adult population aged 64. And we see here that Ukraine has high incidence of education, and here and here, but it is on a par with many other countries like Japan, France, and it depends on the method used. So we have some evidence, but I would like to contribute to the literature more on overeducation and to compare supply of highly educated workers and demand, and also to find some determinants at the individual level. But also what is important, there is a large strength of the literature looking on task-biased technological change or routine-biased technological change and the impact on the demand for skilled workers, unskilled workers, in line with David Otter's seminal papers in 2003, and then many other papers on this. But this literature focuses mainly on these changes in the relative demand for workers, but do not discuss possible overeducation. So I try to look on both sides, demand side and job polarization, if it is in Ukraine, that it is driven by task or routine-biased technological change, and then how has the incidence changed over time, or incidence of overeducation, particularly among tertiary educated people, and also a very important question, how transition-related cohorts, they differ in terms of the incidence of education, and then determinants of the probability of overeducation and undereducation. And first, I would like to present some basic information about educational attainment and literacy proficiency of adult population, trying to answer the question whether the level of the quality of education in Ukraine is at the level corresponds to the level of other countries. First, this statistics shows this graph. This is the number of graduates. Statistical office of Ukraine presents the statistics. This is the number of graduates from universities. This is the number of graduates from vocational and technical schools, and this is the number of graduates from college. And these bars show the share of tertiary university graduates among all graduates after school. And so we see that there is a steady, almost steady increase in the number of university graduates and in the share of university graduates among all graduates. And majority of young people, they just do not consider vocational education because of stigma, hysteresis of habitors, and it is supported by this transition to work survey conducted by the ILO in 2013. And Ukrainian universities, plagued by heavy corruption, became actually diploma mills. They just printed diplomas and they didn't care about quality. If you don't believe, we will look at these two graphs. Here, this axis shows average years of schooling according to Barreilly data set, or share of adult population this completed tertiary education. And here we have mean literacy proficiency score among adult population measured for peer countries based on, for OECD countries based on the PIAC study, and for Ukraine and Armenia based on STEP study, World Bank STEP study. And what we see that Ukraine has very average literacy proficiency score and a bit higher than Poland. And here we see that the difference in the share of population with tertiary education between Ukraine and Poland is almost twice as high in Ukraine, but the difference in the mean literacy is very small. If we look on the mean literacy proficiency score of adult population, total population, and tertiary educated population, they see that Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia have the lowest scores, and we should take into account that in these three countries, the sample covered only urban population. So if we add also rural population, the mean literacy score, there is proficiency in reading and understanding text will be even lower in Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia. So we see that the quality of education and lifelong learning is very low in Ukraine, and so and moreover, Ukraine is the only country in which younger people with university education have lower mean score than older people. That means that really this graduates from universities in the recent decades, they have much lower basic cognitive skills than their colleagues or counterparts who graduated from universities early. And changes in the occupational sectoral composition of employment. And how much time do I have? So we have employment structure changed a little bit, but not significantly, and it is heavily biased towards elementary occupations and services and sales workers. Then I tried to calculate demand and supply of labor by education. Supply, I took just employed by education, and demand employed by occupation, and assuming perfect vertical education job match, meaning managers and professionals have university education, technicians and associate professionals should have a college education, and then all other occupational groups should have a secondary education, except elementary occupations, which suppose primary education. And so we have huge difference. This is the change between 2004 2013. 1 million more people with university education, but only almost half of these jobs that require tertiary education. And we see that increase in the number of jobs requiring no education or primary education, and decrease in the number of jobs and requiring actually education, college education or secondary. And this is changes in employment shares of broad occupational groups. So we see that there is increase in the share of managers and professionals, but at the same time we see increase in the share of elementary occupations and decrease of technicians and semi-skilled workers. And in comparison to Poland, we see that increase in employment of professionals and managers is much slower in Ukraine than in Poland. And in Poland, we see decrease in elementary occupations, but in Ukraine, increase also, simultaneous increase in elementary occupations. So we see this evidence of job polarization, which can be also seen in the US, the Netherlands, Germany, and some other European countries. But the difference of Ukraine that the number of people employed in elementary occupations is tremendously high. And I tried to test those somehow authors' hypothesis that the change in the that employment shares increases actually demand labor demand increases in occupations which are less routine intensive, task intensive, and decrease in occupations which are routine intensive or task intensive and can be substituted by computers and machines. But this graph shows this routine task intensity is taken from the paper by Goose and Manning, but still we see that increase increase in the share of jobs not only in less routine intensive occupation, but also in more routine intensive occupations. For example, these 93, these are laborers in mining, construction, or these clerks, customer service clerks. And what is also important, the composition into between and within industry changes shows that, for example, this occupation, salespersons, large increase is because of between industry changes. So in fact, a growth of sector, of trade sector, and absorption of people from all other sectors. And here I tried to look at the subsample employees from urban areas and merged LFS data set, this step, and looked at the change in the share of employees with tertiary education versus use of computer at work or thinking at work. First, this graph shows that out of 24 two-digit occupations, we see increase in the share of employees with tertiary university in 20. And only in 4 of them they see decrease. And these occupations include also elementary occupations. And this is the intensity of computer use at work. And these are top occupations. So we see these are professionals, managers, but 2 groups from clerks. They need some computer skills, but at the same time, they don't need thinking at work. So I would say that these clerks could be substituted by college graduates if they had better computer skills, for example. And this is about the composition of changes in the employment shares by broad sectors. And so they see that the only sector, like group of sectors, growing steadily is less knowledge-intensive services. These include trade, land transport, different kind of individual services. These are really services that do not need a lot of knowledge. And we see this increase. At the same time, we see decrease in manufacturing, particularly in high and medium-high technology manufacturing, in agriculture, and almost stable share of knowledge-intensive services. So the question is, what is the incidence of education, how it's changed? I do not spend a lot of time on the measurement of mismatch. I use just very typical procedure since I don't have any other alternative. I used mode-based approach. So I using labor force survey data, and it is a very huge representative data set covering about about 200,000 observations per year for employed people. And I looked, I defined required education as a mode level at 3-digit risk occupation, and then calculated this incidence of overeducation or undereducation. And there are, of course, some caveats of this measurement, this approach in the measurement of our education, but the literature uses this approach, and we just need to understand that it can be the case that there are people who are mismatched according to self-employment, self-assessment approach, but they will be well matched according to the mode-based method if there are many people who already moved to another sector, and due to occupational downgrading and crowding out processes, they just crowded out people some level of education. For example, in clerks, we will see a lot of people with tertiary education, even though it is not required in terms of the content of jobs. And these are the estimates of the incidence of education of job mismatch by the level of education. These are, numbers are for the total population, employed population. Here, percent of overeducated this university education, and 0 undereducation according to the definition of this approach. Overeducation and undereducation among people this college education, and percent of undereducated among school or vocational school graduates. And what we see, a very promising trend of decreasing, slightly decreasing incidence of undereducation in all groups, and at the same time decreasing incidence of undereducation, meaning that the match in the labor market improves this time. And also what is important to mention here is very high incidence of overeducation among people with college education. More than half of all employed people who graduated from colleges, they are overeducated. At the same time, 13%, over 13% are undereducated. So only 30% work at jobs that require their education. I tried to look how labor force share of individuals with tertiary education changed over time, and how changed the incidence. And we see expected positive relationship for college education. We see a decrease in the labor force share of individuals with tertiary college education, and we see the decrease in incidence of our education. And it is quite expected. But what is quite unexpected is a negative relationship between the labor force share of individuals with university education and their incidence of their education. And so we saw increasing supply of people with university education, and at the same time decreasing incidence. But it can be explained that probably many people it doesn't tell about better match probably of these people, this university education, but they just became unemployed. And actually, there's the same negative relationship with the share of people, of individuals with tertiary university education. It is increasing over time, so the number of people this university degree increases among unemployed. Here I tried to compare people born in different times, so transition cohorts following EBRD, using 76 as the threshold, and comparing incidence of overeducation among these transition-related cohorts or years, and we see that the difference is not that large. That theoretical literature and empirical evidence in developed countries suggests that overeducation is possible, and it is a mainly temporary phenomenon which affects mainly young people in the beginning of their career. But as we see that the difference is not that large, and probably only among employees with university education there is large difference between young and older, and also between this transition cohort. Maybe I speculate, but I would say that this system of Soviet system of tertiary education was maybe better, and it provided a better match to the current needs of that economy. And it was better match, and people just stay working in their jobs forever, mainly. And these are determinants of mismatch. This is the weakest part of my study. I just try to find the model to find some interesting results supporting my hypothesis. But what is interesting that we can see contrary to the results in developed countries, female have lower incidence of overeducation. They are less likely to be overeducated than men. And we see U-shaped a relationship between age and over incidence probability of education, meaning that young people and old people, they are more likely to be overeducated. And also informal employment, interesting result that people with university education, if they work in informally, they are much more likely to be overeducated. Also, if they work in micro enterprises and in all sectors except knowledge-intensive services, comparing to high-tech manufacturing. And also important, some regional characteristics quite expected that urban workers this tertiary education have lower incidence of overeducation, and in all regions except Kiev, the incidence of overeducation is higher, and there is some positive relationship between oblast level average annual unemployment rate and incidence of overeducation. So in the labor markets, some regional small labor markets, there are few jobs, there is high level of unemployment, high rate of unemployment, and high level of overeducation. And what we can tell that, yes, the incidence of overeducation has decreased, but it still affects about 20% of all workers and over 25% of workers with tertiary education. And it results from a joint effect of demand, supply side factors, quantity of university graduates, but also what is important, low quality. And the relevance of education, I would say poor motivation and academic performance of current students, plus a lot of problems in the system of education and training. Demand problems that start from problems in doing business in Ukraine, labor market and wage rigidities which hinder this adjustment of firms to growing supply of workers. Also the problem of large cohorts of older workers in the aging population, and no investment, almost no investment of employers into training, on-the-job training, and upgrading of skills of older workers. And what is also important, we discovered it 3 years ago, then we did a qualitative study, a lot of focus groups, these people over Ukraine for the World Development Report, that there is limited access to better jobs in local labor markets, which are governed by informal networks or corruption, but not meritocratic principles. So young people, they don't care about the quality of education that they get. They just care about the diploma, about a piece of paper. Employers, they do not care also about the diploma from which university, because they know that in general the quality is very low. So they just test skills, and content analysis of quick content analysis of job ads in current job ads shows that a lot of employers don't have any requirements concerning education. That I was shocked that they ask about skills. Some probably experience, but no word about level of education, no word about field of education. So it means that for many employers, education has very low signaling power, unfortunately. And what should we do? I would suggest to follow the same three-layer policy approach suggested by World Development Report on Jobs, starting from fundamentals that we discussed here a lot and will discuss today, rule of law, macroeconomic stability, enabling business environment, just to push this increase in demand for high-skilled workers, meaning more high technology sectors should first develop and then create jobs. Labor market policies improving matches and also providing voice and extend protection so that to move further these meritocratic principles, not only in Kyiv, but also in all regions, in all small towns and villages. And then I would say these priorities, the third layer, to focus on the workforce development system, and World Bank works a lot in this area. And what I would say that we need to fight corruption in the education system. Otherwise, the new law on higher education will not help, and not only fight corruption, but also to substitute all people who worked in the system for centuries, I would say. They need to go and leave the room for younger people. But of course, we need to link public funding of education to performance indicators, and including teachers' salaries, because if we have salaries like now, we cannot expect increasing quality only fighting corruption, as it was in Georgia, as Eric Livni presented 2 days ago. And I would say that, yes, I would like, since I live here, that we change this question mark and proclamation mark. And please pray for Ukraine just to do this together. Thank you.
Thank you for the speedy and highly intense and complete presentation. We'll have Alexander Danzer from University of Munich provide the formal discussion, and then we'll all get a chance to take a crack at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. First, I will briefly summarize the main takeaway points of this paper. What Olga does here is basically a very comprehensive analysis of the incidence of education-job mismatch, mainly focusing on overeducation. And then what she finds is evidence for job polarization. So we have this strong growth of jobs at the lower and upper tail of the, well, skill distribution, let me say, and at the same time an increasing relative supply of university graduates. And this together leads to a quite persistent job mismatch. That's kind of the conclusion. So there are lots of overeducated people, undereducation is shrinking a bit, and hence there are supply factors. So there are too many formally highly educated workers, and at the same time too many low-skilled jobs. And as a consequence, the high-skilled crowd out those with low or middle education from even low-skill content jobs. I have to say this paper, as I read it, was still preliminary. Some of these tables I haven't seen myself, so I haven't seen anything on the determinants of mismatch, so I'm not going to comment on these. Let me start by pointing out a couple of strengths of this paper. So I think Olga is doing a great job in delivering a comprehensive picture of skill mismatch in Ukraine. Maybe the biggest threat to the paper is that she wants to do too much and wants to cover everything at the same time. But nevertheless, this is very comprehensive, and we get a real flavor of what's going on here. And I think it's politically highly important, but also Ukraine is a fascinating laboratory to study these questions, because on the one hand you have this rapidly changing educational environment, and at the same time a transition in the economic structure, in the labor market, in labor demand, So in the longer term, a move from, well, agriculture, mining, heavy industry to services and whatever else. And this is something, yeah, the question mark here I put it because in the end it's not so quite clear where Ukraine is actually going. So the paper provides a careful shift-share analysis. It exploits a variety of data, and this is very carefully done. So cross-country, within-country analysis, and what I find most interesting or potentially fascinating twist to previous research is the joint existence of different reasons for mismatch between age groups. So among the young one, apparently, there might be wrong education for the existing jobs, and among the older ones, in my opinion, outdated skills might be the problem for changes in job contents. So there are actually two different reasons, and maybe a focus on this could be promising. So a couple of open questions or suggestions to the paper. So the first thing would be to maybe find some exogenous variation in education job mismatch to sort out what's the relative contribution of these two sources, from labor demand or from labor supply. And I think I mentioned before that Ukraine is a fascinating laboratory. So there might be so many things going on that you actually find some exogenous variation here, either on the demand side, like change in regional industrial structure. Obviously, it's always open to question whether that's really exogenous, but I think thinking about this could be very helpful. And secondly, on the labor supply side, the educational system has changed rapidly and quite a bit, so maybe there's also some exogenous variation in here. So the paper as it stood when I read it elaborated the supply side much more than the demand side. And the demand side was mainly restricted to changes across within industry. But what I was curious about is what's actually with changing job requirements within occupations. So aren't occupations changing themselves? For instance, a Soviet time farmer might do very different things than nowadays a farmer can do, and agriculture is maybe an area where Ukraine can have or does have a comparative advantage. So today a farmer might work in a highly technologically advanced environment. Computer-based agriculture might be actually the future. So in this sense, being a farmer or working in the agricultural sector does not necessarily mean that this person requires low skills and might well need computer skills and all these kind of things. What I also find interesting is that the demand side seems to suffer actually from increasing skill shortage. I put here a couple of data from the BEEPs, the data set you also showed in the presentation, and that's just a fraction of firms reporting that the level of education and training of the workforce is an obstacle to the firm's development. And you see between 2002 and 2008, the fraction of firms saying that the level of education is either a moderate or major obstacle increased from slightly above 30% to more than 60%. So more than 6 out of 10 firms in 2008 said, well, apparently the level of skills is not suitable for what I want to do. And this somehow contradicts the notion of overeducation. So I wonder what we are talking about here, and that leads me to the next slide. So the concept of mismatch or overeducation. So from your paper, I read in the introduction that 30% of young people are overeducated formally, but only 5% want to switch jobs. And I wonder, what does this overeducation then really capture? Maybe these people are happy, and what are the reasons they are happy? Are the low-skilled jobs actually paying so much more? So is this a returns to education story behind here, and then it's really difficult to solve this? Or does the job content of the occupation actually require higher skills than you formally assume or the statistics formally suggests? One thing I couldn't really figure out from the paper is whether now overeducation is actually stable or declining over time. So I found both statements, so I wonder what's really going on at the macro level. And then I come to a statistical problem of the method you choose. So you compare these, or you mention these three methods, and you use the statistical method where someone is overeducated if he or she has more education than the mean or the modal worker in this occupation. And the problem with that is, obviously you have statistical different chances for overeducation across jobs with different education levels. And this might not be so important, but once it comes to this environment of a rapid expansion of education, there is kind of a mechanical change in the average or modal educational content of occupations. So you will see a gradual increase in the modal or mean education level in jobs, and this can explain part of the results you find, I believe. Then in background chapter 2, and you also shown this here to us, you use literacy as a reflection of job skills, and I'm not quite sure whether that's the best measure to use. I know many of these things are data driven and you have limitations because you don't have all the data you would like to have, but still I would think about whether literacy is actually reflecting what you are interested in as job skills. And then one thing you are not talking about at all, I believe, at least in the version I've seen, is whether the changes in employment across occupations is now due to workers' job mobility or due to workforce composition. So is it that older people leave the workforce and the newcomers are taking up different occupations or different jobs, or is it that people really flow from one occupation to another? And that's, I think, very important when it comes to policy implications, because we really want to know what's driving mobility or the lack of mobility. And here I just point out this retirement shock because I've worked on this, and in 2005, so this has really induced exogenous variation in workforce composition. One thing with respect to interpretation, so how do you actually interpret routine intensity in your paper? So is this against US labor market standards, or would you think that in Ukraine routine intensity across jobs is different? And I can think of examples that it might actually be very different from the US labor market. And this is something you might want to address. And then another point is the international comparability of your data and your results. So just a note, some of these cross-country figures show data which are not fully comparable, and you're quite open about that. You also have shown this here to us, but still I would be a bit reluctant to put these different data definitions into the same figure, because they still suggest they have everything in common and you can fully compare them. So maybe that's a bit tricky. And then a question about international perspective. You've delivered some answers to this in the presentation. In the paper, there was not so much of an international comparison. I was simply wondering, is this now low or high in international standards, in international comparison? And also linked to this is what the paper does. It compares Ukraine sometimes to Poland, sometimes to Armenia, and I found it a bit confusing, because in a way, Poland is comparing upwards, and Armenia is doing probably even worse. So I found it tricky to get along with these switching benchmarks throughout the paper. So maybe Poland would be the better benchmark all the time. And then I want to say a little bit about policy implications. So in the paper there were none or very few. Now you have developed on this and even put suggestions here. I would maybe do a little bit more on the step in between before the analysis and suggesting the solution. So what's really going on here from a political perspective? So I already mentioned this, that most of the overeducated don't want to switch jobs, and it would really be important to know why this is actually the case. Are the returns to education too low, and why is this the case? And what are the low-skilled jobs that reward university graduates so well that they don't want to switch jobs? So might this give you a partial answer to some of the questions I've raised before? Another thing is quality considerations, and you resort to quality problems in your paper too. But obviously, the statistical method you're using cannot answer any questions about quality problems in the educational system. So maybe another statistic or another way of approaching this question of quality in education can help you to shed a bit more light on this. And then very briefly, some details. So I was just wondering in this figure, what's explaining this drop in university graduation in 2004? Is this actually a statistical problem? Is this a policy change? Is this even delivering some exogenous variation that can help you for your analysis? Another thing is as far as I know, the rapid increase of private education, private higher education in Ukraine. Maybe you could exploit this difference between private and public education, assuming maybe that the old standing universities do a better job or not, I don't know, but this is something to maybe shed light on. And then you show this picture of this trend here between the ratio of employees with tertiary education and the incidence of overeducation. You even interpret this causally on page 26, and I just wanted to point out that this is a bit questionable, this interpretation. Probably you even didn't mean it that way. In a way, the problem is this is really mechanical, right? So the way you measure overeducation with a statistical method leads automatically to fewer chances of being overeducated as more and more highly educated people get into the jobs. So this line is purely an artifact of, or could be purely an artifact of the statistical method you use. Yeah. And then finally, just on the way you write the paper, that's one of the examples where you compare Ukraine to Poland, and on page 9 you write, despite a much larger increase in the share of adult population with completed tertiary education in Poland than in Ukraine between 1990 and 2010. So that's the second line of this table. And I mean, it can be correct, because in Poland this fraction tripled, while it doubled only in Ukraine, but from a much higher initial base. So I think that's one of the examples where both ways of looking at this could be right, and you might just clarify this in the paper. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have time for some questions. Why don't we collect a bunch of questions, and then we'll let Olga answer them. So
maybe I answer first.
You want to answer those first? Okay, answer those first. We'll see how much time we'll have left for everybody else. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alexander. Maybe I will answer some of their comments. For example, about changing job requirements within occupation. Interesting questions, but very difficult to measure. What I can tell about your example of farmer. Last year, we conducted this STEP employer survey. And I was in the pre-test interviewing employer from farm agricultural holding. And then they asked about skills that he would like to see from his employees. Of course, job technical skills are very important in all sectors, and in agriculture. Computer skills are not that important in agriculture. But what is very interesting, they told that a lot of tractor drivers have tertiary education, and even if they don't need it, but the main requirements to them, one of the main, just come in time and don't drink during work. So these are not skills related to computers, to thinking, learning, and something. These are basic discipline and some basic skills that are required, I think, from any worker in any sector, not only in agriculture. Very interesting question, but we just can present, and we will present a STEP employer survey results. So we don't have information about changing job requirements. We have information about job requirements in 2014, and we just can tell that if now they don't require huge computer skills, for example, from tractor drivers, that means there is no change in job requirement, because before they didn't require computer skills for sure from them. About overeducation and why young people don't want to switch jobs, in order to find any other job that uses their skills more efficiently. I also was surprised, but I have explanation that if we do not talk about Kiev, in Kiev the labor market is more civilized, meritocratic principles, so more education, better education, some link these rewards, but in local outside Kiev we don't have this. And over-education and credential inflation is so widespread that young people, they need this diploma just to get any job. And so if they have some job, they do not care about skills use because they know that their friends also work and do not use their skills. And there are very few jobs that could be suggested at local labor markets for them to match, and the quality is very low. So they have the diploma, but they don't have actual skills probably, very often. And also on this statistical method, I know that there is problem, and I tried to discuss and compare this evidence from STEP that I did before. And there I compared several methods, and actually the difference between self-assessment and statistical is not that large. But I will address this problem again in the paper. And also, what are the low-skilled jobs that reward university graduates so well? I presented in the paper table, this is the only source of average hourly gross wage by a two-digit occupation. And what is interesting, that on the first place is teaching professionals. They have about 30 hryvnias per hour had in 2012. On the second place, directors and chief executives, they had 29. And extraction and building trade workers from the seventh group, they had about 26 hryvnias, and they are the third. And a lot of people, a lot of men particularly, why we see high incidence of overeducation among men, they go to these sectors, they can be better rewarded. And if we take, for example, life science and health professionals, doctors, they get 19 hryvnias per hour. So the difference is huge, and even if they, and we have this anecdotal evidence, even if they spend 6-7 years to get diploma of medical university, just because of very low salary in health sector, many of them go to any sectors, including this craftsmen, occupational group, taxi drivers, sales and service workers, and many others, unfortunately. Private versus public education, we have statistics I can add, but usually private education, if we tell about purely private, it has very small share. It is increasing, but very small. But what we have so-called public education, but then students pay. So we have some part of public education which is financed by the state and increasing every year, increasing share of students who pay themselves. And so we have like 3 types of education: purely public, public-private, and private. But because of this system and this flexibility, we got these results, increasing number of people, and universities diploma mills. They just did their business. They didn't care about quality. They just needed to earn money. And that's it, unfortunately. And now we have this law on higher education. It became effective in September 2015. now almost the academic year is almost over. I work in the system and I know that no change, no. We have some changes are planned for the next academic year, but while our heads of departments are 6-plus-year-old men who worked in the Soviet system, they even don't understand which changes are needed. Not just cut the number of hours, but just to change a curriculum significantly, get rid of many unnecessary Soviet-type subjects and introduce new subjects. But in order to introduce new subjects, they need to attract young people who can teach this. But they cannot attract young people because the salary is very low. So, and this is like a circle. And that's why I think that, thank you, Alexander, for this policy implication. Also, I will think carefully. Thank you.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions. If there are, yes, please, let's start. Identify yourself briefly and ask a pointed question.
Hello, my name is Ildar. Many thanks for your excellent presentation. Should I stand?
Yes.
Yes. I have two questions. One is about the entry costs to higher education. You mentioned that there are public, private, but I think more important to talk about the price, right? The cost of education. So we know that the trend was recently that these input costs or entry costs were increasing. So what would your sort of estimate or forecast be how that would impact the result? Would high cost of tertiary education sort of improve the situation with overeducation because many people would not apply? Another question is about the capital. You have mentioned in the beginning the reasons behind this mismatch, the reasons as determined by the EBRD and other international institutions, but I have not noticed capital as one of the factors. So what about the lack of capital in Ukraine that perhaps is one of the factors behind poor results of tertiary education? I mean, you mentioned the computer intensity type of jobs, but maybe computers are not the only capital that matters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Over there.
Thank you again for your presentation. I would like to apologize in advance that for the fact I haven't been here from the very beginning, so maybe you have discussed some of the issues I'm going to raise. Education is very important for the labor market in a meritocratic society. However, we have some doubts that Ukraine is a meritocratic society. Can you please elaborate maybe on the social class background of the respondents in your survey? Thank you.
Okay. If there is no other question, I'll ask a brief question. So I wonder generally if there is any problem with outmigration that might be also explanatory. As I understand, a lot of the practically educated workers, construction and so on, work west of Ukraine. Maybe there is a shortage here. And then generally, I guess there is a conceptual issue more generally about this. People, especially at low cost of education, might take the education as a consumption good as well, right? Now, exposed, you will complain, of course, of being undervalued. But when you make the decision, presumably you take that into account as well. That's difficult to handle. I don't know if you have any handle. Maybe the different cost of education across to different people might be an exploratory part. And finally, when I talk to firms, I'm always puzzled because they always complain everywhere about lack of universities don't prepare, or schools don't prepare the people the way we want. And then you say, so what do what's the shortage? And it says, well, you don't have welders. And you say, well, which school is going to prepare welders? The secondary school, the university, etc. And then you ask them, well, have you thought of raising the wages a little bit? And they said, never heard of that. So to what extent is there an issue in Ukraine, or to what extent is there sort of a general unwillingness to pay higher wage in order to attract labor to a given sector or a given firm, and preferring to complain in the process?
Thank you. Questions of Eldar. Entry course to public-private education. As far as I know now, public universities, particularly now our university or top universities in Kyiv, they have higher entry course than private. So many universities, rational people, many students, rational people, they just choose private education because it is cheaper first, and because requirements they are very low, so it is really as a consumption good. But they don't need any quality in the end. They just need to have this piece of paper diploma. And I'm not sure that increasing cost will change situation. Because as I see from several years of admission campaign in which I participated actively in Kyiv Hill Academy, what is the process? We have, for example, 20 public seats, places. And for them, it is very strict criteria. So I need to call people, and I can provide this place only for person who has very high score of external testing. So first stage is this enrollment of people for these public places. And then we have the second stage of contract-based enrollment. No any requirements, just bring money. They bring money, and I remember 3 years ago I was in this admission campaign, and I had a list of 512 people applying to my department. So I called them to enroll to these public educated, publicly provided places. And then just on this next day, then this stage was closed, publicly provided. The person who was the very last 512, he brought money and he started to study. But now he is on the third year, and he was my student. He appeared only once. And he doesn't need anything. He tells that math is very difficult, that he doesn't need modeling, he doesn't need this and that, and this is on my course, but it is in any course. And then the question, why is he still studying? Because he brings money, and the university doesn't want to get rid of him. And this is one example, and we have these examples. Every year, the number of publicly provided places is going down, but universities need to survive. So we have, it is kind of business. We need to enroll more and more people who can pay. They pay, and they can pay. I remember 3 years ago, or even in the crisis year, 2008, the yearly amount fee was 30,000 hryvnias. It was enormous money at that time, at that exchange rate. And there are people. But it doesn't change the system. So we need to fight corruption. We need to change the staff to change this payment system. Now, currently, it is closely linked to the number of students, and it is not linked to performance criteria. It is not linked to my scientific, my academic performance. No. So what I see from the demographic trends, we see decreasing number of population. So I'm partly demographer. I already projected that the number of students will be going down. What does it mean for me? That my salary in nominal terms will be going down. And what we see, exchange rates, so I just become poor. And so the system doesn't change if teachers will think about surviving. They will not think about innovative methods, about learning English, about going abroad for conferences, because it is extremely expensive now. They will think just about surviving. About lack of capital.
Just 1 minute, yeah.
About lack of capital, it is important, and I mentioned that fundamentals, this doing business is the most important. and including lack of capital. The social class of respondents, I didn't look at this point, but I have also a paper on education job mismatch in Ukraine, Macedonia, Armenia, and Georgia, and I tried to look at different theories of overeducation, and I like social stratification theories. And for French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu in the 70s, he wrote about these hysteresis of habitus for children of lower class people in France who wanted to get diploma just to go up to the class. And actually we see this now in Ukraine, that many children from lower class, they hope to get diploma to use it as a social lift, but unfortunately it doesn't work. And again, there are theories why it doesn't work, that the social origins of people, of parents, play an important role. And in that paper, I had data on family background, and family background is very important. And it is important for skills generation, for cognitive skills, and then it is of course important for getting the right job, because if parents have high education and high professional status, they have the right connections to get a good job to their children.
All right, I think we'll stop here. Thank you very much. Let's join me and both Olga and Alexander. Thank you.